Welcome to Carbon Conversations, a podcast by Biochar Life, where we explore the cutting edge of environmental solutions. From biochar to smart agriculture to the climate tech revolution, we sit down with experts and business leaders at the forefront of change. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey Camille, how you doing? Good to see you.
Good. Good to see you as well.
How's it going?
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. We know each other, but maybe for our audience, where are you in the world? I'm obviously in Thailand, as I always am when I do these things. Where are you this morning?
I'm in Basel this morning. So based in Switzerland, live in Basel and work in Zurich. But from France originally. So
Awesome. And I'm in Chiang Mai, and I know you get here now and then, although we haven't actually met face to face yet, but hopefully it's sometime soon.
It's in the cards. It's in the cards for sure.
Cool. Look, I think best starting point, maybe just a bit of an introduction, yourself and also Brainforest. Maybe just to give a bit of an overarching introduction would be a good place to start before we dig into some of the specifics.
Yeah, sounds good. About me, I started my career in consulting and communication, working mostly for large financial and private equity firms in Paris. My role there, because my background comes from international development and sustainability studies, and so I did a lot of work around helping these companies set up from a different range of either extremely early stage, like this is my first CSR or ESG type strategy, all the way to building up reports and whatever. So that was, the beginning, the first 2 to 3 years of my career. And then I moved after COVID to Biodiversity, which is an innovation. Yeah, they've set up the first global biodiversity score. So it was one of the first players to develop something for us to be able to actually methodically try to measure this complex things that is biodiversity. And so I worked there as part of their innovation team and later as an external evaluator because I started traveling and luck found me and brought me to Switzerland, which is how I came across Brainforest. And Brainforest is a venture platform. So based out of Zurich, we're a non-for-profit organization. And what we really do is we leverage philanthropic funding. So we get donations from foundations across Switzerland to redistribute that to companies who we work with. So early stage startups, we have sort of two key things that we do. It's our venture program, which is really essentially an accelerator for very early stage startups, and our Canopy Fund, which we are currently developing, but that's hopefully going to be the way for us to continue financing these startups once they're past their earliest stage, their very first financing rounds. For us to be able to support that even better in the future. So that's kind of Brainforest right now.
Cool. That's useful. And I want to go straight in there. I mean, I know we've started speaking because of the incubator stuff, and we'll touch on that. But biodiversity as a word, people can probably explain it. But contextually to this sector, and obviously I'm usually speaking to people in the carbon space, climate tech, but for us, biodiversity is really interesting because of what we do is much wider than just carbon credits. And you and I have spoken about this a little bit. Can you help to just define for our audience, not necessarily what biodiversity is as a word, but what it means when you're talking about the biodiversity space, startups, what are these are companies. If I talk about climate tech, okay, it's technology that is directly in support of the climate and reversing climate change. But we're starting to see, and you're working with startups that have a biodiversity kind of lens, I suppose. Talk to us about what that means, and what it's all about.
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things that we've done in the past is, as a starting point, because we work with such early stage solutions and startups and entrepreneurs, we really start by really trying to analyze the problem. And so what that means was we went into it and we were like, what is biodiversity? Exactly what you just asked. Yeah. Where do we even start with this big problem? And I think we came out of it. So we focused on, the Amazon and tried to identify what are some of the nuggets, what are some of the really difficult problems that are reoccurring at different points in the system, in this web, across different stakeholder value chains. And on the problem side, I think we identified 3 big problems. So one of them is really at this stage, the lack of monitoring and measurability. So to step away from complex terms, it's basically understanding what we even mean by biodiversity. How do we measure it? How do we put a number to it? How do we scale it? Just understand it on an objective term. Then
Yeah.
there's a lack of monetary value for like standing forests, for nature, for species. How can we attach some form of a monetary value to that? I think the carbon market has that, right? And I think the intention is for biodiversity to have something of that sort. Uh, as of yet, that is clearly something still lacking. And then there's obviously the lack of standardization. So, like, how do you put that on the same on something that can equate or be equivalent to or compared against the carbon market, right? And so those were some of the problems that we started with, which makes it interesting because as we see, I think it resonates really well with the types of solutions that we've been seeing and that I've been working with. So as you said, I think there's a lot happening around tech.
Yeah.
There's a lot of incredible data being developed, a lot of ground data, and so I think that's an excellent starting point. We have to start there because I think we benefit through this biodiversity market of knowing what went wrong, sort of maybe in the carbon market. So we
Yeah.
can leverage that to hope to do better, to develop ground proofing data to make sure that we have a full picture, that it's irrefutable, that it's not changeable, and that we understand a real situation and that it can't be changed. Yeah, and I think there's a ton of providers working on many, many different ways. It comes from like, it can be satellites, it can be drones, it can be eDNA. There's so many really cool solutions that we've seen across, yeah, across the different startups that we've been able to work with. I think there's a big opportunity for collaboration here as well, right? Because
Yeah.
biodiversity is, despite it being very, very localized, like it's your little ecosystem of like what happens in your forest, what are the types of species that you see, and that you want to restore, renew, bring back, or protect. But yeah, it takes more than one perspective to be able to track and verify all of that.
Yeah, I can see. I think in most emerging in industries or areas. I mean, it's not necessarily industry, but the kind of monitoring, measuring the tech piece from the ground up is something that comes first. You touched on. For me, the challenge is when I look at the carbon space. Very easy to understand the business drivers around how I'm going to launch a DMRV product because producers need it because ultimately credits are sold and buyers need to measure what that credit means, but they're going to put the money into that. What are you seeing, if at all? What are the business drivers for in the development of technology around the tracking? Apart, there's an obvious driver around just being able to see what happens, but there are no. What are the funding models at the other end that make it possible for a founder to say, "Hey, I want to start creating DMIV," in the biodiversity space? Is it because non-profits are putting money in? Is there business models around it? What are you seeing that you can share at the moment?
There's a little bit of both. I think some of the things that we've seen is on. So obviously, foundations and philanthropy is a way for this type of data to be collected at the earliest stage, because the idea is that we just need more of it to have a
Yeah.
better understanding, also on like a baseline level. So I think for that, there are foundations and organizations developing and supporting startups that are putting those efforts forth. There are, however, business models already. So I think interestingly, especially so really what we do at Brainforest and the way we work is to focus also massively on forests. So if you look at the forest, and I think the same could be true probably in oceans and whatnot, but in forests specifically, the interesting thing is if you look at an entire forest and all of its species and all of the maybe untouched, unknown ingredients or things that can come out of it, there's actually many different types of business models that can be created. So like you can be selling new types of seeds or whatever, but in a produced manner so that the communities that are collecting them are able to get a higher wage out of the product rather than be selling it just the raw product for it to be produced elsewhere. So there's a lot of things happening around what we call non-timber forest products. So that's really about setting margins potentially around the proof making of
Yeah.
the fact that these are products that are verifiably positive and enhancing the nature around them because they're part of an agroforestry system, for example, or whatnot. What we also see, and I think it's a massive one, the direct connection and the biggest buyers or the biggest change makers that need to be addressing these issues are the bigger corporates. And so their issue currently is where and how do I even identify what I'm dependent on a biodiversity level? Like what are the natural resources that I'm dependent on? So it touches very quickly on supply chain. And so there we have models around what we call insetting. So these are startups that are essentially providing a very specific solution at a very specific point in the supply chain of their potential buyers, to be able to track and verify, like, for example, if we take the cacao industry, you want to make sure that your chocolate is causing zero deforestation, that it's not causing like child labor or anything like that. So at the earliest, like the first people who are doing the farming for the cacao are going to be, you know, recording these different data sets, sharing that, and then it's tracked through the supply chain. And so there are startups developing essentially supply chain verifiers or methods that are super helpful. And I think there are really genuinely strongly scalable models around that as well.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the insetting model for me, certainly in our space, in the removal space, I feel like it's it should be a bigger area than it is. We've had conversations with chocolate or confectionery companies that have cacao supply chains, and it's interesting. There is definite exploration, but there still seems to be, and it may be actually that biodiversity is a better approach than just looking at carbon, because to your point, there's much more going on than just the carbon piece of this, right? I mean, the supply chain of one of these companies impacts all sorts of areas.
Of course. Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the shifts that I would hope to see, let's see if it does happen, but I think realistically in the near future, there's going to be little to no sense to keep these two things separate, right? I think carbon and biodiversity markets in the end are just one bigger, I don't know if we're calling it the nature market, the ecosystem, whatever it ends up being called. I think eventually it all needs to be part of a singular effort. And I think that's pretty much where it seems to be striving, right? I mean, I think with the ecosystem health protocol and a lot of things that are happening that are with the upcoming COP and all of that, hopefully we'll be seeing conversations around those things maybe merging a little bit more together. There would be some sense in that being the case.
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to use an acronym, VCM. I hate using acronyms because people will be listening that don't know. But anyway, the voluntary carbon market, we're seeing a lot of growth there. We've seen, probably one of the problems we have is that Microsoft is so prevalent as a buyer, and we kind of need wider, or we need more buyers. We need more diversity in the buyer market. But are you seeing I've read some stuff about biodiversity credits. Are you seeing that kind of methodology coming in? Do you think it'll develop in that way, or it'll develop in a different way in terms of just reporting more widely?
That's a good question. I think for now there's not a million players. There are some players that already exist that have developed biodiversity credit methodologies. For now, there hasn't been like a golden rule for like, this is how you define a biodiversity credit per se, because again, I think the major differentiator and complexity around developing those credits is that biodiversity is going to be different in every different landscape that you set it up, right? So it's not going to be the credit value can't be made on the same baselines, because we're not working with the same species and the same ecosystems in Australia as we are in Europe, as we are in Asia, as we are in Northern America, whatever, right? So that's the major sort of factor that has been causing this to be a really difficult thing to come up with. I personally am quite, on a purely personal level, I don't know how much I think credits are the solution, like as a model, for that to be the only way that we can value nature and biodiversity. I think we can also keep scratching our brains to find maybe an even smarter, better solution. I don't have that yet either, but I do think there might be better alternatives than just like a one-off, because I think something that we cannot do with biodiversity that we can do with carbon is a concept of offsetting, right? Like a species once gone is gone. Carbon is always going to be there, right? It's something that's maybe a little less physically tangible. When it comes to biodiversity, something that's left this earth is no longer coming back, right? And I think that in itself also means that we can't just, the concept of offsetting of like, oh, I'm sorry that we emitted or that we impacted this environment. Here's some financing to support its restoration. At some point, restoration won't be enough. So it's slightly different, it's slightly more complex, but I think there's the ecosystem protocol that's supposed to be coming out with some guidances around exactly that, right? What are some bare minimum components that are necessary for us to come up with biodiversity credits, what those might look like, and how they might differentiate across spaces and depending on the urgency of the species maybe disappearing, all of that.
I agree. I completely agree with everything you're saying. I mean, it's interesting because credits are great because they define a market. I mean, they allow us to ultimately scale what we're doing. What's hugely missed out for us is all the co-benefits. Now, we talk about co-benefits, but the problem is because they're not really wrapped in terms of the investment value of what the customer buys. Everyone can talk about co-benefits in a very broad way. So I'm with you. I think I don't know whether credit's the right way. Maybe there's some other kind of reporting investment mechanism that can be out there. So, which kind of
it could be part of like a portfolio thing, right? It could be like a genuine. You could have a whole portfolio of biodiversity cases. How cool would that be?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it leads me to that. I suppose the question around your in terms of your role at Brainforest and what you're seeing in terms of biodiversity investment. You mentioned there's philanthropy funds that come in. I mean, what are the types of investors? Where are you seeing investments happen? What can you share in terms of that front?
I mean, in terms of investments, there's definitely at least according to Serena and some other recent articles, there's been definitely a shift in like a lot more VC funding. I mean, maybe not a lot, but at least here in Switzerland or in Europe, there has been a significant upward trend of financing in early stage startups, specifically in the climate and biodiversity space. For now, those are kept most generally quite large, and it's always a little bit across the two. Yeah. What I've seen also recently, definitely in terms of like the foundations, the family offices, the foundations that are interested in supporting environmental betterment, let's say, there's definitely a big trend of foundations supporting biodiversity projects. Now, obviously, there's always going to be a difference between a biodiversity business and a biodiversity project. There are different mechanisms. One requires having some sort of a business model running it, the other doesn't. So they're different things, right? But I think on both fronts, both on the philanthropy side and on the investment side, there are more investments taking place. There is still the big question, at least in terms of like the impact investment side, for business models around biodiversity. It's a lot about like, how do we conduct a due diligence on a company like that? What are we considering as factors that we want to track? Because again, these are going to be impact-based companies. So we're not going to be looking at maybe the same, like basing it on returns. It's going to be much longer term investments. And so those are really interesting conversations that we've seen take place. I mean, at Hack Summit recently in Switzerland, that was definitely one of the panels that took place where, that's definitely something that they're developing, is like, how do you really track and set up a due diligence around an impact startup? And it's not one size fits all at all. But there are components that are good to benchmark across the board, and there are other components that are going to be on a per case basis. And so that's super interesting.
This is a bit of a left field question, but it just popped in my head as you were talking, and I know you and I've had one meeting when we were on there in terms of and also I worked in a blockchain startup before this, so I'm interested on the things you were saying then. What I've been out of the blockchain space for a couple of years now, and when I was in it, there was a lot of discussion around NFTs for NFTing forest, NFTing land. I mean, it was just, there was so much hot air, it was ridiculous. Everyone's like, oh, we're gonna put everything on chain, and we're gonna create smart contracts around the value of that asset, be it a forest and everything that's in it. Are you still? Where's that at? What's happening today? Are you seeing some? I'm hoping most of the hot air is kind of dispersed, and you're seeing some real kind of use cases. Are you seeing anything, and anything you can share as an example? I suppose is the question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, we've seen a couple. I mean, and we actually conducted a call for projects very recently, so we saw quite some applications in this space. I think in terms of blockchain and NFTs, what I saw was more on like the gamification of it all. So like creating games around ecosystems and stuff like that. So that was interesting. And some of the teams that we're actually working with, again, we're working actually very closely with like MRV technologies and solutions, and across those, a lot of them leverage blockchain more. Like I have yet to see blockchain as like a solution. I think at this
Yeah.
point, blockchain is almost just like the right way to, it's just a supporting tool. It's a good foundation for anyone developing a data-based, a
Yeah.
database solution specifically around, nature. It's just a really strong way to just, keep it together, have one system where it's accessible by all stakeholders, it's open, it's unchangeable. Like there are some like on a values level, it makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
It's extremely coherent to leverage blockchain as the operating tool that supports your data solution. I think it's
Yeah. I think.
quite
Sorry to butt in.
it's quite aligned, is all I was going to say.
Yeah, like I was going to say, yeah, I think what you're saying. I mean, that's kind of. I think that's good to hear anyway. And I agree with you. I have a kind of unwritten rule, I suppose, that if I see someone mention blockchain on their website, they haven't really worked out how it fits into their business model. Because at the end of the day, they should have a business model and a value proposition. And blockchain is just a piece of technology that no one talks about the software they're using if they're selling something different. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean that's refreshing to hear. It sounds like there is some good use cases. So anyway, like I said, it was slightly off topic, but maybe switching to yeah, putting myself in the shoes of founders, startup founders, and let me ask before I ask this question. You run an incubator or an accelerator? Remind me, it's an accelerator, right?
It's an accelerator, right?
Yeah.
So it's 8 weeks. We work with early stage founders, and at the end of that, we select 1 to 2 cases that we want to continue working with and invest into. So it's an accelerator model. Yeah.
So from talking to startups that might be listening, what are the? I've been through an accelerator. It was about 4 years ago, I think. Really useful process for various reasons, but I don't want to give those reasons. I mean, from your point of view, talking to a startup founder that's going into the biodiversity space, that's developing either tech or whatever it might be, what are the real uses of an accelerator? How can they benefit? What do they get from it? The obvious thing is hopefully capital at the end, but there's usually a lot more than that, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's a really cool way to really boost your early stage journey. So again, I think at least with the accelerator that we've set up here at Brainforest, our venture program, we really want to work with, early stage, like essentially first MVP just before your first fundraising round. Like that's the sweet spot of where we can at least provide the most value. It's also been super interesting to see, and we're collaborating more and more closely with other accelerators out there. And there are a lot who offer different levels of support at the different stages of the founder. So I think it can be interesting because no team is ever fully ready, fully prepared, right? So I think it's a really excellent way to get that additional support, specifically on a network level. And I think that's been one of the things that I recently had a ton of conversations with different mentors. A lot of them are actually multi-time founders and have done startups themselves and found themselves in a realm of different worlds at many different times of their lives. And interestingly, I heard it a few times actually where the person or the mentor basically said, I would love to work with you and to work with your potential startups because it's when I was developing my thing, I would have never gotten where I got to, and it would never have been the success that it became without the help that I got along the way. So this is my way to pay it forward. And so I think it's such an amazing opportunity to be a part of essentially a bigger platform that helps you leverage a network. And specifically, I think a lot of accelerators now try to really focus on specific areas, on specific themes. We really focus on forest and biodiversity, and our experts and our network of partners really are so deep in those topics that there's something almost pleasant about you can come into any meeting and never have to explain the problem. We can benchmark, we can set that aside and let's start talking about what's actually something you want to talk about and deep dive on today. And so I think that's a big support at the earliest stage. And obviously the intention, as you said, is financing at the end of the day. So having received the right advice from the right experts at a moment that is pretty critical. So as I said, sort of MVP to first fundraising round, so much happens. It happens so fast. Getting those first customers, having that first pitch deck, all of those things, and having traction, having the right people by your side, all of that is going to contribute to a better story, a stronger story in front of a potential future investor. And so that's what we're also hoping to drive and support. Obviously, we all have the same goal. So, yeah.
Cool. What do you mentioned VCs very briefly at the beginning. What are you seeing in terms of the types of funders that are coming into these accelerators and looking for opportunities, looking for the next unicorn? Are you seeing the traditional VC space, or is it a whole other kind of financing space? Is it a mixture? Yeah. What are you seeing?
I think it's few VCs, at least for like the models that we really look at Brainforest are for impact, for profit, but the impact genuinely comes first. And so obviously there's some impact VCs out there that are starting to really develop an understanding and a due diligence process around which they would be able to invest into cases like that. But it is far from being a classical investment.
Yeah.
I think the other types of investors that we see are like, business angels, family offices, people like that are increasingly interested in those impact-driven solutions. And yeah, so it's always a bit of a mixture, the people you see in the room, the people who are interested. But I would say those three are probably the most prominent for, again, like the early stage, the pre-seed. Once a company is at a growth stage, we're also talking slightly different terms, but that's a little bit less of where we operate.
Cool. And what about leadership in terms of or female leadership in terms of the sustainability sector? So when I say that, I mean, yeah, it could be startups, but more broadly, I have a kind of perspective on it. I see it as pretty flourishing, but I might be wrong. But I'm in this space. I see a lot more, women leaders inside business than I did when I was in traditional tech, for example. But yeah, what are you seeing? What's your perspective? What needs to change, if anything? Is there more support needed? Yeah, give us a female perspective on leadership across the sector.
No, I think I quite agree with you. I've had such the pleasure to meet so many wonderful women across the space, either entrepreneurs or event creators or VC founders, or like on every scale, like every type of stakeholders that we get to work with, be it foundations, be it investors, be it entrepreneurs. There have been incredible female leaders that are driving those initiatives. So I think it is a space where there's something that works. I think women are inherently very resilient, very we do think future, maybe sometimes a bit more than our male counterparts. And so I think there's something about the sustainability space that makes a lot of sense, that is extremely close to at least my heart and a lot of the people who I surround myself with. I think at least on the entrepreneur level, or something I'd like to see more, is more female entrepreneurs, for sure. Yeah. I don't know exactly what it is. Again, this is a very personal interpretation, because I've seen some of my very close friends dabble with the idea of, hey, should I do something? Should I step out of this 9-to-5 job and give this a try and go on this passion project and sort of take that leap? And it's so challenging to take that. Yeah. To take that extra step. But what I have noticed is, at least for me, being surrounded by similar women who are working in these types of spaces, who really want to push to help you move forward. And there are a lot of accelerators, I've come across 3 who specifically focus on female founder empowerment. I think is so important. Because I think there's a little bit of an ego thing maybe about it, wanting to take that extra leap, wanting to go into it and being yeah, let's go, let's try it, let's put in this collective delusion of wanting to make the world change. And there are a lot of really powerful women supporting that and supporting those female entrepreneurs as well. So yeah, happy to share those as well at a later time.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. I mean, that's all positive. I also think it's, you ask these questions, I ask the question, but it's just not, everything's much more nuanced, right? Because I think the other thing is, a lot of this is different depending on the geo, the country. I mean, there's just, there's such different conditions in different countries for whether you're a man or a woman starting a business. I think it really does vary, and I think the US is probably a lot further along the track, and obviously, parts of Europe where you are, Switzerland, I would hope. So, yeah, I mean, I asked you a question, but it's probably a lot more nuanced when you look at it globally, and
For sure.
you look at startups, particularly here in Asia. So, I didn't have a load more questions, but I wanted to end, I suppose, on talking about the future, really, and the work you do, Brainforest. Anything you're excited about when you look ahead, any predictions for the future, anything you'd like to share in terms of putting yourself into the future.
Predictions for the futures. So like operationally, I think we're super excited. We're going to be kicking off our fourth venture program next week, actually. So we've just onboarded all of our teams, and that's going to be really exciting. So that's going to be the end of the next quarter is definitely going to be exciting and pushing forward some new ventures. Also in some new spaces. We're lucky enough to work with founders from 5 different continents. So we're really, really global. So
Awesome.
very happy that we're delivering on that promise to support founders from all over the place. So that's exciting. And I think something that I would wish for the future. I don't know how high to hold my hopes, but I'm really excited to see what comes out of this COP, this Biodiversity COP. There has been a lot of talk around biodiversity. I've seen so many events this summer, this year, even just here in September. I think Climate Week was also really pushed around the biodiversity topic.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that that's setting the stage for now a bit of a genuine shift into clarity. I think that would be my hope for 2025, is to enter into a year where we can have clarity, guidance, and more collaboration and collective sharing. Because I think at the end of the day, there's still a new space, it's a new market, so we're all going to need to keep learning from one another. So collaboration is going to be key, but with that strong intention to provide clarity and
Awesome.
Keep following into that.
Cool. I didn't have any more questions. If there was anything I didn't ask that I should have done that you'd like to share, please do. Otherwise, also share where people can get hold of you, learn more, get in touch.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're pretty active on LinkedIn, so feel free to follow Brainforest or myself there. And yeah, I'm also super happy to share it with anybody who is a listener. Any of the accelerators that I've heard about,
Cool.
For female founders, for biodiversity. There's us, but there's also many others working on the support system for entrepreneurs. And I think it's so important to keep, sharing that community so we can all benefit.
Awesome. Well, I will, for anyone watching or listening, I'll leave any of the links that you can provide. I'll have put in the speaker notes. So any links for accelerators, and also the Brainforest LinkedIn page and stuff. So cool. Look, thanks for taking some time out of your morning. I appreciate you joining. It's been good to do this and interesting as well. So
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Enjoyed it very much.